having a battle tonight. 2 weeks ago, as mentioned, we hosted a battle between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. On behalf of Bitcoin, there was Tom Bass, and on behalf of Bitcoin Cash, there was Justin Bonds. And tonight, we are having a battle between permissionless and permissioned blockchains. And we believe that as it comes to people who will be defending the views on the both of them, we are having the top people in the Dutch blockchain community. Let me share something with you about the structure. So the structure of the debate basically is time constrained. Every part has given amount of minutes, and we start. Both of the speakers will start with introduction. Then they will have 2 minutes for rebuttal. Then 7 minutes cross-examination, and then 3 minutes for final statement. So let's get started. Please welcome Justin Bonds from Cybercapital on behalf of Permissionless. And Frans Kempen from IBM on behalf of Permission Blockchains. Okay, what is going to happen now? We are going to toss a coin. I'm a bit no coiner tonight, so
again.
Does anyone help me, please? There you go. Okay, thank you. So you guys decided to start. Or you can come up with different methods.
I think this one. That's tails, I believe. That's hits.
Yeah. So then I decide. I'll allow you to decide.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
And the time limit, you'll be able to see the time limit on the screen over there. And our audience is the time limit up there.
Okay.
So let's get started.
Wow, that's exciting. So thanks for inviting, and thanks also for having a discussion here on the table. And indeed, I was a little bit scared when I see the website. It's about a battle. Because I don't think the choice between the two platforms or the two protocols is not a battle. It's about what is fit for purpose. So if you would like to ride a Tour de France on a bicycle from children, you don't go any far. But if you have, let's say, an older cycle for older people with an accu, you don't use a bicycle for Tour de France, but use a bicycle with an accu unit. So for every purpose, there's a different blockchain. So you need to see what purpose do I have, what do I want to accomplish, and so what kind of type of blockchain does it need. So for Hyperledger Fabric, you notice Hyperledger is not, it's an open source community founded by the Linux Foundation. It's the biggest growing project in the Linux Foundation, and Fabric is one of the overall platforms. So you have different protocols. You have the Fabric for business use. You have, for instance, also Project Indy, Hyperledger Indy for identity, etc. And so there are 4 or 5 other projects within the Hyperledger Foundation to build blockchain protocols for business use. And IBM is a contributor to that environment. We denote code and development and resources to build this further. So many companies are implementing blockchain Fabric for their clients, as well as IBM. So we are one of the many, basically. So I say, it is an open source platform. Anybody can download the code and build a blockchain on Fabric for this. So IBM is doing it as well. And my responsibility for Netherlands, or the Benelux, is basically I'm building now 3 kind of platforms. One is an automotive platform for car transportation companies. The other one is a platform for Food Trust, which we just announced in the new release. It's a company in Holland who imports and exports fresh fruit, basically sources from Chile and sells to retailers. And the third program I'm now going to build is a provenance platform for mining. So, for instance, cobalt is mined a lot with children. So we have a cobalt provenance platform to avoid child labor. And this is something we're going to build on the blockchain to sell to. And cobalt is used for producing batteries, and the batteries are sold to, let's say, Apple or whatever. And those end clients would like to be sure that those cobalt is mined without using child labor. So it's kind of provenance platform. This is what I do daily. So I work with developers, I work with coders, designers, etc., and with clients to build it. Based on, indeed, Hyperledger Fabric, which I think is a nice platform for businesses to do business on using blockchain technology. I have still 1 minute. I can donate 1 minute to you, or some questions on this introduction.
Questions
Are there
will
any
come
questions
later.
at the moment?
Question. There will be Q&A afterwards.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So
Let's continue. Let's continue, Justin.
So, I would actually agree. There certainly are different issues where permission blockchains, at least for the time being, make a lot of sense. Though I would argue that public blockchains, as we know them, they have certain advantages. What we describe as decentralization are the characteristics of censorship resistance, financial sovereignty, immutability, and all of these characteristics are actually the big innovation in blockchain technology. And if you create a permission system or a federated system, depending on how it's set up, there are definitely advantages compared to the current system. You could potentially have high degrees of transparency, for instance, or cost is maybe a more difficult matter, because in the case of cost, maybe permission blockchains are more expensive to set up, and maybe an interesting discussion to have, whereas the startup cost for a public blockchain is lower. So there's definitely a trade-off there. But I think in many ways that is not the big innovation here. And I like to make the comparison to something like AOL, in that I would say that something like permission blockchains are the equivalent of AOL, in that they take parts of the technology, but not the parts that are most innovative and that provide these very radical advantages. And that, I think, is an important thing to consider. So the question, I think, also is asked is when do you need these characteristics? Because I think for a lot of projects, say for instance, if you're a company, for instance, and you want to put your stocks on a blockchain, right? By doing this, you add transparency, right? But you're still tied to some sort of authoritative body, be it a state or a registrar of some sort, that has the ability to reverse transactions and to reverse ownership. So the advantages that blockchain brings in this case are not met if you use a permission blockchain. So yes, there are advantages, but if I were to compare that to the transformation that the innovation of public blockchains has brought us, or at least the potential of this technology, then I would argue that that's actually far more significant. And over time, obviously, I would expect permission blockchains definitely to find their place for multiple applications. But I think the question needs to be asked is, for any project, is do you actually need censorship resistance? Do you actually need immutability? Do you need that frictionless characteristic that public blockchains provide? And I think another very important point, and I think one of the key differences between a public and permission blockchain is also it's the question of governance and power and who decides. And when you're creating a permission blockchain to get the whole world to use it, or to get all of these organizations or countries to use it, there's a lot of politics involved in that. The ability to send value across the world for fractions of a penny is not, before Bitcoin was invented, that was not technologically impossible. It was not possible because of the politics around having everyone to agree with each other, all of these different stakeholders. What a public blockchain provides is a neutral platform, a platform that doesn't have specific allegiances to, say, specific geopolitical groups or corporations or so forth. So I think this is a distinguishing feature. And there's certainly trade-offs to be had. So, and I also agree, this is less of a battle than, I think, an interesting discussion on where we're going. Thank you.
Now we are good to continue with the rebuttal. 2 minutes.
Okay, so, well, the general topic is you need to see what kind of use case are you supporting in building this blockchain platform, right? So I'm talking about blockchain for businesses. So then you ask a question, what does the business need to do business together? What are the requirements of business clients? Suppose they have a network and they want to do business together. For instance, in the automotive industry, I presented last year as well. So car transportation, for instance, these are 5 big car transport platforms in Europe, companies in Europe, who exchange a lot of documents with the OEMs, with the car manufacturers, etc. What they want is, they want a network which is fast and have a high transaction speed, thousands per transaction per second, at no cost, immediate finality, so immediate, when you do the transaction, immediately finality, and there must also be a privacy element in it, so some information on the blockchain, they do not want to have to exchange with other companies in the same blockchain. For instance, you deliver a car, but you do not want the price to be shown to everybody on your network. So there must also be a kind of privacy element in that blockchain. That's another example. Also about enforceability. So if the partner in your blockchain network is not sticking to the rules, right? So you can have a smart contract, you can execute it. But what does it mean in real life? So you need to have a system where you can enforce the execution of an agreement, right? Also, you need to have a link between the digitized world and the real world. So in the digitized world, you can exchange value, right? I can send a coin to somebody else and you can prove that you have it now. But if this coin represents a car, and I sell you this car with a coin, who guarantees you that I will also deliver the car? So there must be a connection between the digitized world, where tokens are exchanged, and the real world, where the assets are exchanged. So, is that finished?
Yeah.
Okay, as summarized, these are elements which business find important. And then you find a platform which can comply to those requirements, basically.
So if I were to identify 2 things you brought up, one is the connection with the blockchain, with the real world. Another thing you brought up is the that these companies need no fees, essentially a zero fee system, right? And I'll be the first to admit that this is not possible with a public blockchain. You can't have a public blockchain that has 0 fees, because then you end up with the spam problem that can essentially attack a network and creates an attack vector in that sense. Now, you mentioned the connection of a blockchain to the real world, and this is also known as the oracle problem. Now, public blockchains actually, can achieve this, I think, with a fairly high degree of effectiveness by having a quorum of oracles, which are known institutions, trusted parties, and then they can essentially vote on a chain in order to determine what is the truth in the real world, who won an election, did this earthquake happen, whatever it might be. So that is a solution that I think that is a problem that public blockchains can solve. Now, you mentioned the question of enforcement, that you need some sort of authority to enforce that the contract is executed in the way that it's supposed to be executed. Now, that's exactly what a blockchain does. A blockchain does this without a central authority. A blockchain is able to enforce the rules of a contract because the way the system is designed. It's, instead of having a hierarchical structure or a centralized system with authority, the blockchain is designed in such a way that the incentives actually align in such a way that it enforces contracts, that it enforces the validity and checks against fraud. One of the reasons blockchains don't need this type of external regulation is because they are actually self-regulating. They have incentives acting upon them that actually allow the system to function without an external centralized authority. And as I mentioned before, that is one of the primary advantages of public blockchain. Thank you.
And now time for cross-examination interactions, 7 minutes.
Okay, so I have a question about the point of oracles. I mean, my point was basically, if somebody doesn't stick to the rules, what ability do you have to enforce it? In a private blockchain, or you have a permissioned and non-permissioned platform, and you have private and a public blockchain. These are 2 different elements. So permission, non-permission. Fabric is an open platform, but permission. So anybody can join, but it should be vetted. There should be a legal entity. You know where this company founded, who the owner is, so you can sue them if anything happens, right? So that creates a system where you have a smart contract. A smart contract are always executed, but if digital execution has taken place, but the physical execution doesn't take place, what is there for action to take? you need to have something, and not an Oracle, because Oracle is still digital, right? You can have external information on your system. But what about the physical transportation of goods? So you need to have, that's a legal entity who executes basically the physical contract.
Well,
so how do you solve that in an public blockchain?
Well, in this case, the Oracle actually verifies that the goods have been delivered in this example. And then the oracles would then vote on that, and then the contract will execute. Like that does solve that problem. I mean, it's, to be fair, it's a lot more difficult than just having a central authority verify this.
Well,
but that comes with other traffic.
Yes, about the central authority, right? I mean, in a permission blockchain, we have, let's say, a group of companies who come together, who said, well, I want to do business together. They know each other, and they collectively decide what is the governance model. What are the rules of the games in our ecosystem? So there's not one company who rules that in a permission, and there's a governance model, and they say, well, I have 10 companies, 20 companies in my ecosystem who work together. All the 20 have the same vote, and they vote democratically on certain rules. They are accomplished. So there's not one party. The point is that due to this permission platform, you get a kind of consensus protocol which is much more easy to execute compared to a trustless platform. And therefore, the speed of transaction is much higher, the costs are much lower, and the enforceability is much higher as well. And the privacy element is much higher. So if these elements can be implemented in a public blockchain, it's fine. I mean, companies do not care if it's a public or a private blockchain. They will have their requirements implemented in a blockchain, which is immutable, which you can audit all the way back to history. But these elements about privacy, cost, speed, finality, etc., these have to be implemented in this platform.
So you mentioned immutability, but I would argue that the guarantees of immutability are much weaker in a federation type governance system when compared to a well-designed public blockchain. And I think that that degree of immutability is part of where these niches are created, where some projects require that high guarantee, and other projects are usually already existing businesses, might see it more as an improvement on their current processes. And I think there's a differentiation there where for a lot of projects it actually doesn't make sense to be on a permission blockchain, because then it doesn't provide those guarantees, it doesn't create these new characteristics that are so innovative and evolutionary about these systems.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about, let's say, forking, right?
Yeah.
And about, let's say, the development roadmap of a public blockchain or a permission blockchain. So, for companies, it's important to integrate the blockchain platform into their legacy systems. So they spend a lot of money in integration technology, right? We have some companies here in the audience who provide adapters. I learn now how to integrate legacy systems with the blockchain, but every company has different IT systems, and they need to integrate to the blockchain, right? Some data from the legacy goes to the blockchain and vice versa. If you have built your integration platform with your blockchain, and then the public blockchain, a bunch of coders says, well, I'm going to design this new release, and this new release is not backward compatible in terms of integration with what we have done before. So then the company can throw away all its integration technology because of the new release.
I think that's a bit of a radical argument, because what we've seen is we have seen, especially with large cryptocurrency projects, this is kept in mind, and in many cases, there is this, for instance, the smart contract language in Ethereum fundamentally hasn't gone through severe changes. If you developed a smart contract 2 years ago, chances are it works perfectly today, even with all of the hard forks. And saying that it's easier doing this on a permission blockchain, I don't think it's necessarily always the case. In many cases, there's a change. You just update your node, you restart it, all the commands still work, and the network continues. You're less dependent actually in many ways on these type of changes. But I think it also depends on how you feel about these companies, or what type of federation this is, because that definitely, I think, depending on who your federation members are, also has a very different characteristic on the outcome of decisions. Whereas in a public blockchain, in terms of the incentives, and especially as we start to understand these things better, I would argue it's actually far more predictable in comparison. You also mentioned the enforcement aspect, and anti-fraud, today is, for these companies, cost them billions of dollars in preventing fraud and credit card fraud and all these type of things. But public blockchain doesn't actually have this cost attached to it because of, it's a public blockchain, its incentives are aligned in such a way that, this cannot occur. I mean, identity theft in that sense.
Understand. So another topic is, let's say, the speed and the cost, right? That's important as well. So on the public blockchain, there's a rumor. Questions. So on the public blockchain, what is the number of transactions for the fastest public blockchain at the moment? Per second.
I think about that. Per second, 23 megabyte blocks, so that would be about 300 transactions per second currently. For something like Bitcoin Cash, I would say, based on the stress test.
Okay, so that's a top one, right? I mean, the rest is lower than that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't disagree in terms of.
Time's up, but we can go up to 1 minute.
All right.
So wrap it up.
No, this is a very good point, and I mean, I think what's important for public blockchain is if it's able to keep up with demand. If it's able to keep up with demand, it's able to perform its economic functions. And I'm not going to deny that there's problems in scaling blockchains. Ethereum, still needs a lot of development in order to be used at wider scale.
But not only on scaling, right? Also on privacy. I mean, I say privacy before scaling, right? To be honest, but it's not. I mean, Hyperledger Fabric is connected to Ethereum, by the way, right?
Yes.
There's a project who connects to read the smart contracts of Ethereum in Solidity. You can read it in Fabric and vice versa. So it will be an internet of blockchains.
Yeah.
I know that about. Within the Hyperledger Foundation, you have Indy. Indy is an open platform, not permissionless. I mean, anybody can join Project Indy. So that can be connected together as well.
Yeah, referring to privacy in something like Ethereum, I think if scaling is improved in a platform like Ethereum, it actually, by definition, also solves the privacy problem. Because if the transaction fees are low enough, zero-knowledge proofs become economically feasible over that platform.
So my point is, all the list of requirements, if these list of requirements can adopt to any other blockchain, I think businesses are willing to take the other blockchains platforms. It's about requirements fit for purpose basically.
In the next step, you have 2 minutes to wrap up your arguments, so we cover this.
I did it already, so.
3 minutes.
I'll start with the final statement.
Okay, go ahead.
What was the last thing you said there?
Fit for purpose.
Fit for purpose, that's right, yes. So in terms of transaction limits, I think I'm at least confident that public blockchains can keep up with demand as technology improves, and something like the Bitcoin code base just requires some optimizations like parallelization, and much higher transaction rates can be achieved. But I would actually agree with you on a lot of things here, and that one thing that I'm also personally very excited by is public-private interoperability, actually.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think a lot of companies can really get the best of both worlds. If they don't want to subject their governance, they don't want to subject their contracts to a public blockchain, which I think for many people is still a very scary thing, then they can, be within their own closed garden with a private blockchain and have their own internal business operate that way. And when a private blockchain needs to interface with the larger world, it can directly interface with a public blockchain and leverage that as a neutral platform where you can transfer value to China to maybe a competitor company or some sort of scenario like that. But in terms of my closing statement, I'll say that I would again go back to the comparison of in the early days of the internet, that the concept of a public internet was not embraced by a lot of companies, and a lot of companies ended up setting up intranets, or I also mentioned AOL, these type of walled gardens that are very tailored and much more permissioned in many ways. But I think even though I really admire the work you're doing, I think it's great work, and I'm sure some of these projects are definitely going to help a lot of people. I think in the longer term, I suspect that the advantages of a decentralized and public blockchain will become more apparent to the wider public, and I'm looking forward to the day when these internets and AOL start to embrace the World Wide Web in this analogy, because that is how history has also played itself out in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you.
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. I don't take 3 minutes.
It's okay.
Because for me, it's your point, your last point about companies did the intranet in the 90s, and the internet disappeared because the internet was in the end so safe and so much functionality that the internal companies or the communication between was you could use the internet for that purpose. So that can be done here as well, right? If the public blockchains will develop in terms of all the criteria I mentioned, which companies are valid, if these elements are adopted and can be scaled and can be priced, etc., and cost on the public blockchain, companies don't care. They don't care. Maybe the permissions will be disappearing in the future because of the public blockchain has those characteristics. At the moment, in the next 5 years, it will not happen. And at the moment, companies would like to try out what the technology can mean for their businesses. Because it's not about technology, which is key for business, but also the way of working. Because a company needs to think on a totally different way in using blockchain technology. They need to work with their competitors, with their suppliers, with their clients, exchange information. How does it work? All these governance models, all these ecosystem models, all those new business models, how to earn money in the future on a blockchain technology platform within your ecosystem partner with your competitors. How do you earn money in the future when you change? So that model, those elements are much more important to think about for clients than the platform, the technology below it, because it's only a way to connect databases, right? Don't blow it up, what a blockchain is. So that's why I think in the future, it's very good that companies are trying to work on it. So let's work together to convince business to work more with blockchain technology, because it will benefit us all. They have a huge amount of money. They will invest in developing blockchain technology even further. So I think it's good to work together, but explain the differences between the different platforms. It's not either or, right? So let's try also to see what elements can we learn from the permission, what elements are key for them, and that translates in a kind of roadmap for the public blockchain as well. And scaling is important, but privacy is important as well, and transaction costs. So indeed, in Fabric, as I said, the connections is already being made between public and private, and that's a good way forward. So that's why I like this not battle but discussion, but getting it clear what the difference is, what the key criteria of both platforms are, and how public, private, and business people can benefit from this. So thanks for this opportunity to explain about permission blockchains.
Thank you very much. So basically, battle without access. We believe you enjoyed. Now it's time for a Q&A session. We can take up to 3 questions. First one.
Yeah, thanks for this delightful discussion. I missed one argument, at least for that goes for both types of blockchains. One has it more than the other. That's trust. And you told Frank that you were also having a project on cobalt mining to have it more to check if the cobalt is not mined by children and stuff. So there's a lot of trust involved in the results of that project. How do you relate that to the amount of trust that public blockchain has? And in my opinion, it has more trust than permission blockchain.
Well, trust. If you build a system in your blockchain network that you can prove that something is happening, and you go to your client with this information, this proof basically, then you create the evidence where then your trust is built upon, right? Yeah. So all is about the element shit in and shit out. So if you do not measure at the start what goes into your blockchain in terms of data, if you do not control that quality of data, then the blockchain trust has no use, right? So you need to convince your end customers that the data was input is correct data. With cryptography you can do, with authentication, with hashing of documents, the documents cannot be frauded. With IoT device you can measure it. So if you have a track record of systems of record which you can verify and monitor and measure.
Yeah, but that's the same for both permissions and non-permissioned. But the censorship freeness of the non-permissioned blockchains is, in my opinion, higher than than for private one. Because I would trust a company that has its own blockchain solution and says, well, just buy my product because my blockchain solution says it's child labor free. Yeah. And there's the one that has a public blockchain. I would trust the public blockchain company more than the private one.
Depending what kind of entities are in your blockchain, right? If only are companies who are really benefiting from that level. But if there's external auditing companies who are also part of your blockchain network, which you can decide, like UN has a node and can audit the transaction, or other companies who have a neutral status, etc., can also be part of your. So you can decide for yourself what companies will be part of your network, so that the ecosystem will be a kind of neutral way to check and balance the content together.
Yeah, but the more nodes you have that are not permissions, the more the level of trust will increase. Or don't you agree with that statement?
I agree with the statement that, let's say, the entities in your network should have different angles, different point of views, right? Yeah. You have somebody from Greenpeace who should be there at the network level, somebody against child labor, but also the commercial mining company, right? And they keep each other honest. So it's about the quality of the network of participants who define, let's say, the trust level and the quality of the output.
Is that feasible? I mean, to create such blockchains with such nodes?
That's why I say it's not about technology here. It's about setting up a governance model, collecting entities in your ecosystem, which in collectiveness can decide on something that's true, put it on the blockchain and verify it and expose it to everybody else. So it's about a process model, which is the most difficult part. And that's a learning element, right? I mean, all companies are learning how to build this business ecosystem on top of blockchain.
If I might add to this, I think we're discussing the Oracle problem again. But beyond that, and I think you're correct, that definitely depends on the different participants within your federation, the quality of those outcomes, right? But I could definitely foresee situations with, say, cobalt mining, for instance, that the cobalt mining company sets up their own blockchain and then they report that it's all perfectly legitimate and no child labor is used. That creates very obvious conflicts of interest. I think that, and like I mentioned before, especially in the world today, and especially with the state of public blockchains, in some use cases, permission blockchains might make sense. But I do think that your statement is actually true. That if you compare, the different, members of your federation, now you're dealing with old political problems that, have not always been solved and have not always been reliable in the past. Just because you have a permission blockchain does not mean that you have those guarantees. And then you actually need to look at the politics and the companies involved, and it becomes very complex for people to even evaluate this. Now, when you compare this to a public blockchain, where the participants in the blockchain, either be it miners or stakeholders, historically, at least for major blockchains, no fraud ever occurs. It's foolproof for the most part, as we've seen. That is a much stronger guarantee. But then I'll go back to the question: is that not all companies want such a strong guarantee, and not all companies want to disrupt their own business models.
Yeah, that's why this initiative of, let's say, that businesses would like to adopt a blockchain is really good, and we should support this.
Yes,
we should support in educating businesses what technology, how blockchain can be benefit their business use. I mean, there's so much money floating around, so why not funnel it into this new technology to develop it even further? And it's not the case that each company benefits from blockchain, right? Sometimes a distributed database may be even better, a centralized system. But in some cases, it's really good. So let's educate the people and the companies what it can do, what the plus and minuses are, what the differences are, and then select by themselves in terms of their criteria.
One thing I'm excited about is seeing someone build a public blockchain based on the Hyperledger technology. That's something.
That's the best of both worlds.
We can take one more question from the audience. Okay, there in the back.
Yeah, something. Earlier in your talk, the gentleman from IBM, earlier in your talk you said that there should be some form of privacy in the transaction. And I think I interpreted that so that, if you send something from A to B, that not everybody can see it. Even though some of the, when you said that, I thought it maybe challenged one of the core sort of like hallelujahs about the blockchain, that it would forever be public, because that's like the core principle of it. How do you think that private companies will or can or should or may use this? And this is going to happen.
Well, what happens on the blockchain is similar to the real world, right? I mean, in the real world, when companies do business together, sometimes there's some information you would not expose to your competitors, right? Or your suppliers, or your customers, right? So you should have an option in your blockchain protocol which enables a privacy element. I mean, maybe it's fully open, but if companies really in a governance model decide collectively that this specific type of information should be confidential, for instance, medical data, right? If you have a patient records, etc., some medical data which is sensitive, some information should be kept private between two parties in an ecosystem of many, then it should be possible. That should be possible now, not in 5 years from now, right? It should be possible now. So that's what I mean, there should be a privacy option in that blockchain platform as well.
I agree, I have a video on YouTube that I believe I cannot delete, so.
I think it's worth saying, that a lot of public blockchains can be used privately. Some are designed to be very effective to be used privately, and others are very difficult to use in that way. But like even something like Bitcoin can be used in a private way as well. So, you know, public blockchains do also have this capacity, and I would actually agree with you. Blockchains should give people this option.